intended to. I would like to acknowledge the OCLC Research Library Partnership, which both underwrites and inspires our work. Attendees from this webinar are from the OCLC RLP, and I want to thank you for your continued support and input into our work. Those are both crucial to our success. So today, I am thrilled to welcome Xiaoli Li from UC Davis and Karen Smith-Yoshimura, my colleague from OCLC Research. I am going to turn things over to Karen to get us started off. So I'll take you off mute, Karen, and take it away.
Thank you, Marilee. So today, Xiaoli and I both participated in the OCLC research project last year using a Wikibase platform to create entities called Project Passage. We focused on multilingual support, and as Wikibase is the same platform underlying Wikidata, our multilingual experiences there are the same as those you'd find in Wikidata. First, a short summary of Project Passage, the OCLC Research Linked Data Wikibase prototype. It ran from December 2017 through September 2018. 16 OCLC member libraries participated. The objective was to evaluate a framework for reconciling, creating, and managing bibliographic and authority data as linked data entities and relationships. The pilot Wikibase instance we used included 1.2 million entities, mostly data representing overlaps between Wikidata, VF, and WorldCat. A crucial aspect of this project was that it allowed all of us to create entities and make statements and claims about them without needing to learn the technical underpinnings of linked data like triple stores or RDF. For Xiaoli and me, we also could explore the multilingual support. During the weekly office hours, Passage pilot partners showcased some of the use cases they were working on in describing resources and the related entities in the Wikibase structure, highlighting the issues they encountered, which often led to additional features or properties. These are some of them: a digitized map, a poster for an event, a musical work associated with an event, a digitized postcard, and a photo within an archival collection. We all learned a lot, and it was so much fun. Details about these use cases are in the upcoming OCLC research report on the project. Today, Xiaoli and I are focusing on two other use cases: Chinese descriptions and representing works and their associated translations. I will now hand off to Xiaoli for context setting and her experiences with creating entities in Chinese. Xiaoli?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everybody, for joining today. I did take a quick look at the participants list. I think several of you have heard this presentation before, so I'm sorry this is a repetition for you, but hopefully I will bring up something slightly different from previous presentation. Okay, as Karen mentioned, UC Davis had the opportunity to participate in Project Passage, and I think that was a wonderful experience, and especially for catalogers who haven't had much opportunity to participate in the project like this. And also because it's a sort of a sandbox project, you really can use your imagination and do things you probably normally wouldn't do in your production environment. So I think that type of freedom is also very valuable to us. So the next few slides for catalogers, especially if you're Chinese cataloger, you're probably already aware of those issues, but presentation was created just in case people don't have those background information. So first thing, I think when we talk about how do we want to move to some new things, first thing is looking at what we have been doing and identify issues or problems we try to address. So I'm just going to use a few examples in next few slides to demonstrate some pain point we're currently experiencing using MARC format or our practice. So first one, I used this very famous Chinese novel as a demonstration to show our current cataloging practice. So the first is the one in the circle. That's one of the author actually is a primary author. So the slides showing in the authority, how do we create a name heading for this individual? As you can see, 100 field is authorized access points for this individual, and the native scripts is listed in 400 field, which is considered a reference, and it's not showing in the record, or it's not being used as a matching or anything. It's just as a reference. So currently, primarily for human being to use. And the bottom screenshots just showing in the bibliographic record how we've been creating or describing this resource. Again, in the similar thinking, we have romanized fields for titles, for authors, and for publication, but romanized fields are considered the primary access or primary data entry, and the native scripts is optional. But I know more and more libraries are put it in as inputting Chinese, it's become more easier. And also we have macro can help transliterate Chinese scripts to romanize the form, even though require some human intervention. But at least there's some automation, automatic tool to help. So currently in bibliographic record, if there's both romanized form and native scripts, they're being linked together. We call them parallel fields. This screenshot is coming from OCLC, so they're all linked as the same MARC tags. But in our local system, we have romanized fields in the respective MARC fields, but then native scripts are all in 880 fields. So next slide I'd like to show, it's just some sort of issues we're dealing with native authors when we use romanized form as the name access points. So on this slide, as you can, if you can see, there's two different authors that have same last name, but the first name, which is the second character, is different when you written it in Chinese character. But when you romanize them, they look exactly the same, because when we do the romanization, there's no tone associated with each romanization. In addition, Chinese language is to the romanization, from romanized form to the Chinese character is not a one-to-one relationship. One romanized form sometimes can relate it to maybe more than 50 different characters. This is a situation for the first name of those two authors. They're two different persons, but when you romanize them, they come up with the same romanization. And unfortunately, for these two particular authors, they're born in the same year, so we couldn't just use the year to differentiate them. So we had to add the months after the year to separate them. So this is just one of the pain point in a way, especially in current environment. Many people have concern of showing a person's birthday or even including birth months in the authority record. So the other thing we talked about in the library world, we create the metadata. One of the purpose is definitely supporting discovery and also supporting library operation, and then also to be able to share or to reuse each other's data. So if we all romanize that same author in a different way, there's going to be very challenged to reuse other people's data. So same author as the Chinese novel I just showed before. So first romanization of his name is from US, and second is from France, and the third one is Estonia romanization, and the Portuguese and Korean. So if different library use different romanization as the main access point, it would be really hard for us to utilize each other's data without any type of crosswalking. Next thing I want to show, this may be specific to the languages which do not have a space between characters. And so like Chinese, when we write down the Chinese characters, we do not have a space to separate the characters. But then when we do romanize those and we follow romanization rule, in the rule it tells you, the rule tells you when, at what situation you may connect two romanized characters together, at what situation you have to put a space between each of them. So I'm using these 4 characters as a demonstration to show, even though there's a very detailed rule tells people how to use it, and that rule hasn't been able to apply it consistently, or maybe people just have a challenge to interpret the rule itself. So those 4 characters is showing at this picture is Chanjiang Liuyu. Translation is here, Yangtze River drainage basin. And this picture just to show the geographic areas. So the next 3, just a title I picked up from a real from OCLC, so they're real. It's not something I just made up. So the first titles, those 4 characters is here, and the romanized form, which I highlight, no, I had underlined in the red, showing 4 characters being transliterated into separate characters, and each of them has a space in between. And the second example, first 2 romanized characters are combined, meaning there's no space. And the third, first 2 combined, last 2 combined. So with space or without space does affect your searching, finding the record in OCLC. So that demonstrates one of challenges for Chinese cataloger when they search. They have to try, sometimes they have to try different way just in case they miss the record. So people may ask, why can't you just use Chinese character to search? Because if you do that, then you will find them all. Well, as I mentioned before, the native scripts in current cataloging practice is considered optional. So which means not necessarily every single record will have Chinese characters or native scripts in them. In fact, Karen will talk about the percentage currently in OCLC, how many records may still lack native scripts. So this is another pain point. So next few slides, I'm just going to show you. You see Davis experiment with project passage, and just to highlight a few things I found it seems like eye-opening for us to say, oh, we can do that. That's great. And so I'm hoping you feel excited as well. So first thing, when we creating the entity inside passage, project passage, so one of the things we could do, this is probably OCLC added this feature because I didn't seeing that in the Wikibase, original Wikibase software. So when we try to put in the Chinese character, I could go down to the granular level to indicate the written style or written theme. For example, for this particular one, I can specify this is a simplified Chinese when I input those Chinese characters. And once I finish the inputting and it showed after my characters, it tells me this is a simplified Chinese. So this type of granular detail may be very helpful to, it may not necessarily helpful to human being, but it probably very helpful for machine, which we were relying on to manipulating the data. So one of the possible things I can think of to use is if we input data in this type of level, maybe we could rely on the machine to do the transliteration for us if it's necessary, because it would be much easier for a machine to recognize those characters if we have information. Next one, I think this is more about how we currently dealing with authority control or authority record. As I mentioned before, regardless what language, where the author comes from, what form the name is written, we want to use romanized form as access points. This may have some purpose and probably still have some purpose, but what I want to show is in the project passage, the language itself doesn't seem to have a controlled how people can use the information. So for this example I'm showing you is we create this entity for Sun Zhongshan, a very famous Chinese, I have it here, description. So we create the information in a language maybe we're familiar with, but then other people can go in to add other languages familiar with them, transliteration or whichever way they do. When I choose English, his English format, the form of his English name is showing here as the label which I can use. But if I prefer to use Chinese label, all I need to do is change that English language here to Chinese. Well, it's not moving to next slide. Okay, so when I change that from English to Chinese, it will give me the Chinese label as his name, and any description a cataloger or whoever put it in as Chinese will show. So what this tells me is in the environment, as a cataloging agency, we really do not have to control what language or what scripts we should show to our patron, and they should be able to choose whichever languages they feel more comfortable to use. And I think this is one of the things we talked about it, but we currently cannot do it in our environment. But Wiki give us this opportunity to see what the future might be able to do. So with this language, no preference and so on, you can come up with so many different applications. So one of the things I'm showing you here is those are the knowledge cards in the Wikipedia article. And those information can be easily extracted from the Wikidata, which is created by catalogers. And then when you're extracting them, you can choose whichever languages you want to use in that Wikidata, Wikipedia entry. So those just showing you 5 different languages can pull in from the Wikidata entry, but create different presentation in the Wikipedia. So this is just one of possible use when you don't have to specify what is the primary access point for a particular entity. And also when you have a language information associated with each statement, and that's how you can pull the information out this way. So next thing, I just want to have 2 slides to show you the other examples we found. Wow, the Wikidata type of description actually is quite useful. Currently in the authority creation, this is one of the ancient Chinese city called Bianliang. So later, because this was in the 960s to 1127 time period, it's the Northern Song Dynasty. So it's an ancient city. And because it does appear in the literature, appears in different places, so catalog created authority record for it. And then later it's called a different name because when China changed, there's dynasty change, and also in the current environment, it's not calling that ancient name anymore. So it does provide this later name, but there's no telling when this name was used. So in the project passage, we create that entity for that same name. This is a Chinese character, and there's a transliteration here, and it gives you the description. But the most important thing is we also was able to show when that name was used in what Northern Song Dynasty. And so this is what it says, in what time period this name was, or this entity was used. So that's another thing is when you have information provided this way, it gives your patrons more context to understand and to identify or to verify information. So that's another thing I think as a cataloger, we know those and we have those information, so it would be nice to share that with our patrons. So with this, I think I finished my presentation for the slides I prepared. But one of additional thing I would like to mention, in case you are interested, UC Davis is currently joining linked data for production PCC cohort group. So our focus in that project is to see how we can cataloging Chinese materials in linked data environment. And because that's our focus, I was very happy when Larissa Welsh from University of Chicago and contacted me, says, could we set up an affinity group to evaluating or to exploring how we can do cataloging in linked data environment for non-Latin scripts material. Definitely Chinese is one, and the CJK, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Arabic, lots of language. Currently we're cataloging it. We call them non-Latin scripts. So we formed this group, and I see Larissa is also on the participants list. So we welcome you to join us if you're interested. I will be happy to put the link to our wiki site for you to know how to join if you're interested. And our group meets every other Tuesday-ish, basically twice a month. So far, I have found it's very, very helpful because we learned from each other. And in the past, I think we pretty much work this on our own, or maybe in our perspective community. For example, CJK work with CJK since we have Council on East Asia libraries, and then maybe other language group has its own group to work. But this is, I think it's the first time, or maybe I'm wrong, but at least it's the first time I participate in a group. There's so many different languages are presented there. So I'm hoping we will come up with very, very good some practices. I call it a community practice or practice of community to understand how we can deal with these issues together. Thank you so much for listening. Karen, now it's back to you.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you, Shally. I'd like to focus on the case studies we did on translations. The cream of the world's cultural and knowledge heritage is shared by being translated. It's how we learn about other cultures and how other cultures learn about us. WorldCat contains many rich cataloging records for these translations, and our Project Passage participants had homework assignments to enter works and their translations into our Wikibase sandbox. So translations are a time-tested channel for learning about other cultures. It's a key method for knowledge transfer. Only 7% of the unique authors in WorldCat have works that have been translated into at least one other language. This is what I call the short head, as opposed to the long tail of works that have the most impact on readers worldwide. I've listed here a few titles, some classic, some written by Nobel Prize laureates of literature, in the original language and script. I think most of you have heard of all or most of them, but probably in another language. And those are the English translations for those. This is the model we used for representing a work and its associated translations, with some of the translations of Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, along with a few key properties. Each translation has a translation of work relationship to the original German work, indicated by the red arrows. There can be multiple translations into the same language. In this case, we're showing two Korean translations, one with Hangul only and one with Hangul and Hanja, published in different years and with different translators. And the earlier translation has two translators. We identified 570 translations in 33 languages for Heidegger's Sein und Zeit in WorldCat. We translated that model into a desired minimum set of statements for our Project Passage participants. For work, the original title, the language of the original, everything's an instance of the work, authors of the original, and the earliest known publication date. And for translation, the translated title, the language of the translation, always an instance of translation, the translators, the earliest known publication date, and most important, translated from the title of the original work. So I mentioned that we imported the entities from WorldCat to populate our Project Passage Wikibase. WorldCat's metadata can identify translations of works, but it's often not easy. In the first record on the left, there's no indication what the original language was or the original title. And although Chiodi is accurately represented in this added entry for this Italian translation of Sein und Zeit, the relationship is shown as an author rather than as a translator. On the right, there's a much richer record for a later Italian translation, also by Chiodi, and here the original language is identified as well as the original title. And there is an added entry for Chiodi, correctly identified as the translator, and we can consider this as a gold standard for representing a translation in MARC. But as long as some records accurately reflect this information, we can assert the correct relationships for the records that lack the information. However, there are many translations where we are not able to do this from WorldCat alone. These are all the passage entities retrieved by a Sparkle query that had a translated from statement for Sein und Zeit displayed in a timeline. I chose to display in the timeline statements for language of the translation, the translated title, the translators, and the date. The four circled here are for Japanese translations, each by a different translator. Some translations are better than others, especially for languages as different as German and Japanese, which is why it's so crucial to identify the respective translators. This visualization far exceeds what we can accomplish with raw MARC records. Currently, there are over 30 million records in WorldCat with non-Latin scripts for 34 different languages. But 76% of those non-Latin script records are for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. 29 non-Latin script languages combined total only 1% of the total. Romanization thus predominates in WorldCat records for most languages written in non-Latin scripts. And two of those languages are Greek and Persian. WorldCat has records for these translations of Sein und Zeit, but only in romanization. The two entries we saw on the earlier slide have Greek and Persian scripts because we ingested them from Wikidata. During the Passage project, we learned how crucial a discovery layer was, not just for end users, but to the metadata creators to verify that all the inverse relationships were indeed represented. In this case, we show that the original work, Sein und Zeit, was translated into other languages that list on the right. This discovery layer we created during the Passage project also pulled in images from Wikimedia Commons and descriptions from DBpedia. So it serves to remind us that the pretext descriptions we're used to putting into our MARC records could be pulled in from other sources instead in a linked data environment. Linked data offers us not only the opportunity to represent authors, translators, and titles by identifiers rather than by text strings, but also take advantage of other linked data resources to enrich our own data sets. So in this case, we're showing the mutual benefit we see between WorldCat and Wikidata. From Wikidata, we can pull more multilingual, multi-script labels, other identifiers, and common descriptions, for example, knowing what the first publication date is, but WorldCat has far more richer bibliographic descriptions, far more translations, and more library-related identifiers. So, in some of the lessons we learned from the use cases in Project Passage, and particularly those relevant to the two we discussed here, is it blurs the line between the traditional distinctions between authority and bibliographic data. Instead, our thinking turns into what entities matter for this particular object. It's valuable to see the impact of our work as you work. In the translations is an example of that, where when you create it, you're saying this is translated from, but you can't actually see all of the translated intos until you look at that discovery layer that we used in Project Passage. It needs to interoperate with other sources. One of the first things we discovered is the need for importing data from other linked data sources. And in fact, the retriever application that OCLC research colleagues developed was to pull data from other sources instead of having to duplicate the work in the Wikibase instance. So we talked about whether this all represents a paradigm shift. As Xiaoli showed in her presentation, there's less need or no need to romanize non-Latin scripts if you just focus on representing whatever object you're describing in the language you're used to, the one you're comfortable with, and let others add their transliterations, their descriptions in other languages. The whole concept of language of cataloging then becomes obsolete. However, we still need interpretive context. The Northern Song, it needs that interpretation that the Kaifeng used to be known by this previous name in a previous time period. That kind of context is what's really important, even in a linked data environment. We had to do documentation, and there's a continuing need always for best practices, even in a linked data, Wikidata environment. And most important maybe to the participants, we had lots of discussions about the need for showing authoritativeness and equality. Now, Wikidata does provide features such as a very detailed audit trail, discussion, and so forth that we did not take advantage of during the project. But the question is, if you use a crowdsourced environment like Wikidata, how do you differentiate the input from librarians and other professionals and experts from those who also have an opinion but are not as trustworthy or as authoritative? And that's an open question. And with that, we've finished our presentation and we're open to questions.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Xiaoli. Unfortunately, when I started this webinar, I did not click a crucial button. So at the beginning of the webinar, participants were not able to check the all participants option in the chat. I did enable that, but you may need to scroll down to find all participants. So if you sent something to all, what's the other option? All attendees, unfortunately, I don't know why WebEx has this option, but if all attendees, the panelists and the host don't see any questions or comments that went to all attendees. So if you have entered a question, I'm going to give you a minute, and I see some coming in now. Thank you very much. To find your question and paste it back in. And I'm going to ask a question myself. Karen, you mentioned the report on Project Passage. And can you say when you think that that may be coming out? Because I know that this is just one aspect of Project Passage and that there's other types of case studies that will be represented in that report.
Yes, the text has all been finalized and it's now in the process of being formatted by our excellent communications team. So we're hoping for a July publication. Okay.
Thank you very much. We are looking forward to that, and you'll be seeing that broadly distributed. So Megan Wacha from CUNY has a question. Thank you both for your presentations. Xiaoli, I really appreciate the points you made about data reuse. Somewhat relatedly, Karen, you talked about pulling data from Wikidata. Wikidata is under CC0 public domain dedication, so everything can be freely used and shared by all. Will this be the case for data created by OCLC? What rights are attached? Sorry, I need to scroll back up. What rights are attached to the data created as part of this pilot, and will the data be pushed back out to Wikidata? So this might be a good opportunity to talk about the purpose of the pilot and any future plans.
Yeah, I mean, the pilot served as a sandbox, an experimental sandbox for everybody to feel free to make mistakes, do things that they might not otherwise do in a production environment. So from the get-go, we promised everyone in the project, at one point, I think altogether we had 90 OCLC member staff participate in some way or another in the pilot project. No, it's not available. Once the pilot finished, the Wikibase things closed, which is why in the project report we do screen captures, because no one else can actually see that, because that's the downside of being a sandbox. If you want people to be free to just experiment and not care what kind of permutations others will see, it also means you don't want to make that public afterwards, because then everybody's saying, that's a mistake, that's a mistake. So, and it was short-lived, you know, so, but the question that you raised at the end is still the one that the participant also asked, and I think is being asked within the PCC. When you have a separate Wikibase instance, and you do enrichment, especially if you import data from Wikidata and then you enrich it with other information, you want to be able to share what you've enriched to Wikidata itself. So when I said that one of the key reflections of the project is the need for interoperability. If you do an installation of a separate Wikibase instance, as for example the German National Library is currently experimenting with, there is a need that you will want to share those enrichments back to Wikidata. And how that's going to be done, I don't know, but yes, that is a certainly a valid issue that people want addressed.
So just to reinforce my understanding, that is in project passage, people were assured that the data would not be shared, that this was a sandbox,
right.
and that people could feel comfortable being in full experimental mode without revealing their errors. And I would say that or errors, whatever, their experimental mode. And I would say that catalogers have a different sensitivity to their work and exposing their work. And there's probably quite a bit of variety within the cataloger community, but this was something that did make people comfortable participating. I'll also say, and this is a supposition, Karen, you were actively participating in this, so you can correct me, but I don't believe that there was a huge amount of data that was created. It was mostly discussions and modeling, and that there wasn't. People were doing this kind of in between their full-time jobs, participating in the pilot, so I don't think that there was a tremendous amount of data that was created in the process of the pilot.
Well, and what's productivity in a linked data environment anyway? It's not like I describe X number of books on a trolley. In this case, it's how number entities, and that's one of the things we do discuss in the report, is if you have a poster of an event, well, who's depicted in that event, and where did they do the concert, and then you have to create a place for that venue, and it happens to be in a place that's not in Wikidata. So you end up creating an entity, another entity, another entity, another entity. So quite I don't remember the count, but probably I would say in some total hundreds of entities were created, and some of them might be a dozen or more, just for describing what would in a bibliographic universe be one resource. So even the concept of how many, what does many mean in this context? How many statements, how many claims, how many entities?
So thank you. Another question from Stephen Hearn: are the descriptions in Wikidata at the level of transcriptions, for example, a particular item, or at the level of works expressions? So that's one question.
Yeah, that was work expression. Yes, okay. So we did a scoping statement for the project passage that said we would focus on the original work rather than all of the expressions. Now, that gets into murky ground, because a translation is a translation expression, or is a translation as a work. So we basically said just treat a work and any translations from the work. We did not deal with editions. I think, but it is very murky because we are in the bibliographic universe. We've been exposed to the concept of WEMI, the Ferber work, expression, manifestation, item, and now we're thinking of just terms of works and instances. But I've been advocating, I shouldn't say we, I personally have been advocating, let's not worry so much about whether it's a work, whether it's an expression, and focus instead on what it is and what its relationship is with everything else. And if others call that a work or other people call it an expression, let them call it what they will. Let's just focus on what the relationship is.
So just to interject a little bit, Stephen's question was about Wikidata and not about passage. And I would say that my observations about information about bibliographic items in Wikidata is that there is a great amount of variety and that there is quite a bit of mixing levels, if you will. And part of that has to do with Wikidata's heritage in being created by bulk importing information from a number of different language Wikipedias, and then also different project interests. So I don't think that you see consistency at this point in the treatment of things like translations.
Isn't there a project merely on trying to find the Wikidata book project or something like that for defining a model for book?
Yeah, there's an ongoing project. It's not terribly active for modeling books, and I think right now that the idea is that there would be a work level and then edition level information, and that one would help to support things like citations, and that the other would help to support things like the representation of a work. But anyhow, it's a complicated discussion, and there's quite a bit of, I think, work to be done in terms of modeling. Stephen's question has a second part to it, asking about Wikidata rules on representation and transcription for problematic characters. To my knowledge, there are no Wikidata rules, but maybe others know differently. And again, I think this goes to one of Karen's, on the previous slide, Karen had talked about kind of open questions, and one was, you know, I'm going to just go back a slide here and bring back, because I think that this was the best practices, you know, co-developing best practices, and that would be different in a kind of, you know, if there was a PCC Wikibase environment, then you could kind of set and monitor your own rules, but doing that in conjunction with a larger community is a different kind of question. Yeah. Something that would probably be welcome, bringing that library expertise. Catherine says, I'd like, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'd like to second that. I think in the Wikidata environment, truly really not a lot of rules. It's really based on to me, it's more community practice. For example, there's so many so many projects happening in the Wiki environment, and each project community probably come up with a way to do what they want to do. So that in a way is the same. If libraries are interested to do something in that environment, and we probably will work with the larger community, but we probably have a lot of freedom to set up our own practice.
Yep. So a question from Catherine Grove, just echoing that that the question about CC0 in Wikidata versus OCLC information is crucial to the discussion, and I am not able to say anything about this. This was a pilot, and I'm not sure how we're planning to implement Wikibase technologies going forward, but we are aware that this is something that's incredibly important to the Wikimedia community. So those discussions, I think, are happening within OCLC, but I'm not personally in a position to say anything about that.
I think the closest thing in response, I mean, like I said, what we did in the pilot, of course, it's closed. I mean, the access is closed. But if you think about VF, the Virtual International Authority file from OCLC, that's available as CC BY, which is the attribution license. So and it is very much used in linked data implementations. In my linked data surveys, VF is right at the top as one of the most used linked data resources by other linked data implementations. And to get to the end, the identifier embeds VF. So in fact, every time you use a VF identifier, it always has a VF in it, and that was considered attribution. So that's just one instance of using OCLC generated identifiers data in a linked data environment that has been addressed. What we do going forward, I think, is still under discussion by our OCLC colleagues.
We are talking about creating a couple of sets of data that would be usable by the Wikidata and Wikimedia community. So stay tuned for information about that. It's looking at data sets that would be particularly useful for looking at information about women or indigenous people, and hoping that that would help to enrich Wikimedia projects. So stay tuned for more information about that. Yes, and this is a great conversation for partner libraries to have as well for OCLC to continue to discuss with the member community. As Catherine has reflected, this is something that's important to the larger community. So thank you so much for raising those as questions. We continue to definitely work with that and talk about that on an ongoing basis. I'm not seeing any more questions at this time, and I do know that there is an upcoming, the LD4 group is hosting a discussion on Wikidata right after this. So I imagine some of you may want to grab some coffee or take care of a few things before heading off to that meeting. I know that Karen, I, and other people will be attending that meeting. So I just want to thank you all so much for a lively presentation or lively conversation. I'm sorry that there was confusion about some of that, the chat details at the beginning. And I want to especially thank Zhao Li and Karen for their wonderful and thoughtful presentation. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much.